I have served you faithfully, planned all for the good of England.
You have served yourself, Cromwell. Your protestations ring hollow.
There is a story England never stops whispering of two queens, two scaffold mornings, and one king whose mercy was as cold as the steel that ended them. When most people think of Henry VIII, they think of a bloated tyrant with a desperate hunger for sons and a trail of women behind him. But they rarely stop long enough to trace the blood left behind on the execution block. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, names that sound almost interchangeable in the mouths of careless history. But they died in such violently different ways that to compare them is to peel back the flesh of the Tudor court itself. And look at the rot inside. Anne was fire and thunder from the very start. The woman who turned the world upside down just by being chosen. It was for her that Henry broke England from Rome. For her that a new church was born. For her that a queen was discarded. And a crown handed to one who had once been no more than a lady-in-waiting. But what the king gave, he could just as easily take away. And by the year 1536, Anne found herself dragged down the Thames in a barge, still bearing the title of queen, her hair blowing wild in the wind. As the Tower of London rose dark and tall before her eyes, she stepped ashore at the Queen's Stairs, the same steps she had once ascended as a new monarch only 3 years earlier. But this time, there was no cheering crowd, no music, no banners. There was only silence, and a man named Cromwell, waiting in the shadows, Catherine Howard, on the other hand, and never had the same majesty written into her bones. She was a girl barely out of childhood when she was married to the aging king, a man who could barely walk and whose legs stank of rot. She had been passed around, failed by her guardians, and taught only how to be pleasing, not how to be safe. When she was arrested at Hampton Court Palace, she screamed so loudly that people remembered it for years. She was manhandled by the lords, her royal clothing stripped away, her title erased, and her journey to the Tower was not one of dread majesty, but of raw fear. She was taken in through Traitor's Gate, and as the boat passed under London Bridge, she would have seen the heads of those she had been accused of loving impaled on spikes, their dead eyes staring down at her like a warning. She was no longer a queen. She was barely a girl. And yet, the sentence was the same. Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery, incest, and high treason. She was accused of plotting to kill the king and of taking her own brother to bed, even though the charges were riddled with impossibilities and lies. And she was granted a trial, if only in name. The men who could have spoken in her defense had already been executed, and the outcome was sealed long before she stood in the courtroom. But still, Anne retained the dignity of the crown, and even on the day of her death, she was addressed as Your Majesty. She was given a French swordsman, specially summoned from Calais, for Henry feared that the English axe might require more than one blow. She was blindfolded, helped up to the scaffold by the lieutenant of the Tower, and allowed to speak to the crowd. Her words were composed, heartbreakingly graceful, pleading for God to save the king, asking no man to meddle in her cause, forgiving all. She knelt, repeated the words, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," and waited. The swordsman, silent in his socks, so that she would not hear him approach, raised the blade high above his head, and with one clean swing, ended her life. Catherine Howard had no trial. A law was passed after her marriage that made it treason for a queen not to disclose her sexual past within the first 20 days of wedlock. By the time she was accused of adultery, the law had already taken root, and the punishment required no legal performance. She was imprisoned, isolated, and informed the night before that she would die at 9 o'clock the next morning. She reportedly asked to rehearse, having a block brought into her cell so that she could practice placing her head correctly. In the cold morning light of February the 13th, she was led to the scaffold, shaking, pale, and so weak that she had to be helped up the steps. Her voice barely carried as she confessed her sins, spoke of God's commandments, and begged forgiveness. There is a legend that she said she would rather die the wife of Thomas Culpeper than the Queen of England, but history cannot confirm it. What is known is that she was blindfolded, knelt, and that one swing of the axe ended her life. But unlike Anne, her body was not placed in a coffin. She was covered in a black cloak, dumped into a grave, and buried with quicklime, an act not of preservation, but of destruction. One queen died with velvet beneath her knees and a sword hidden beneath the straw. The other died with no ceremony, no title, and no chance to defend herself. Anne left behind a daughter, Elizabeth, who would rise to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Catherine left behind only silence, shame, and a grave that cannot even be found today. The place where she lies is guessed only by the presence of lime in the soil. No stone bears her name. Only a commemorative plaque marks the spot. Both were victims of a king who could not love what he could not control. Both were discarded like broken jewels once they failed to serve the purpose he had imagined. But history, as it often does, remembered one and erased the other. Anne became legend. Catherine became a cautionary tale. Yet here they are again. Two queens kneeling in the same tower. One beneath velvet, the other in straw. The sword that waited quietly, the axe that wasn't forgiven. It began with the quiet rustle of velvet in the corridors of Greenwich Palace. The kind of sound that might have meant nothing on any other morning. But for Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, the soft hush of footsteps outside her chamber was the opening note of an ending she did not yet recognize. It was the month of May, in the year 1536, when the king's soldiers came, cloaked not just in fabric, but in authority. And their eyes did not meet hers as they handed her the folded parchment that bore her name, written in a script that trembled with betrayal. They spoke gently, but the words had edges. She was to come with them immediately. No reasons were given. No charges explained. She was still queen, still adorned with the invisible weight of a crown. But already, the walls around her had begun to shift, and the air in the corridors had turned colder. They took her by barge, a procession that lasted 3 full hours. The oars slicing silently through the River Thames as the city moved past without looking. She sat stiff-backed, silent, her gaze fixed on the water as the Tower of London grew larger in the distance, its grey stone towers reaching skyward like fingers of judgment. She had come to this place once before, as a queen in triumph, crowned and radiant. This time, she was carried to it in silence, not through Traitor's Gate, but through the Queen's stairs, a small mercy that recognized a title she still carried, even if it was already being pried from her hands in secret chambers behind her back. The boat bumped gently against the landing, and she was led up the steps and into the royal apartments, the same rooms where she had prepared for her coronation just 3 years earlier. They had not put her in a cell. Not yet. There was still an illusion to maintain, but even as the door closed behind her, the world outside had already decided that she would not leave the tower alive. And then, there was Catherine. It was a November morning in the year 1541, and the chill in the air had begun to seep through the stone of Hampton Court Palace. The lords did not whisper this time. They stormed. There was no gentle knock. No quiet parchment with gilded seal. There was panic. Fury. Shouting. Catherine Howard, no older than a girl still learning the edges of womanhood, was dragged from her chambers in terror, her screams echoing through the great halls like the cries of a bird caught in a storm. She had once run barefoot through those halls, laughing, radiant, a child woman with a crown too heavy for her head. Now, she was being pulled like a criminal, her gown torn at the shoulder, her hair disheveled, her face pale with disbelief. There was no moment to compose herself. No words of farewell. No last glimpse of the window, where she had once waited for the king's return. She was shoved into a barge, her hands trembling, her breath visible in the cold, and the river swallowed her screams. The journey to the tower was short, but merciless. As the boat passed under London Bridge, she looked up and saw them. The heads, the rotting skulls of Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper, the men accused of loving her, mounted on spikes above the water, their mouths open in a final, eternal gasp. Catherine turned her face away, but too late. The image would be burned into her mind, like a brand. She was taken in through Traitor's Gate, the low arch yawning like a mouth. And there was no pause, no hesitation. She was no longer queen. She was no longer even Catherine Howard. She was prisoner. Traitor. Ruined girl. The walls of the tower, once silent for Anne, now echoed with the sound of dragging feet and muffled sobs. Anne, for all the horror awaiting her, was still afforded a shred of dignity. She was placed in familiar rooms, surrounded by ladies who still called her Your Majesty, who wept when she passed, who brought her quiet news from the outside. She asked for music to calm her mind, and someone played a lute softly. Even though their hands shook, she paced the chamber, waiting for news of what charges might fall, what trial might come, what sentence had already been signed. She was confused, but she still believed in the possibility of fairness, or at least in the dignity of her position. When she prayed, it was with a measured voice, her back straight, her eyes unclouded by fear. Catherine was shown no such mercy. From the moment of her arrest, the title of queen was torn from her like a garment. There was no trial, because none was needed. The law had already been written, crafted like a trap with her name etched into the wood. It said that a queen who did not disclose her past within 20 days of marriage was guilty of treason. It said that her body would belong to the state. It said that no voice could save her. She was locked away, not in royal chambers, but in a bare cell. The walls there did not remember joy, or music, or ceremony, only footsteps, only death. And yet, in those separate rooms, behind those separate walls, two women waited for the same fate. The same king had loved them, and used them, and grown tired of their voices. The same kingdom had once praised them, and now looked away. The same cold blade would silence their names, but history did not record them with the same ink. Anne was remembered for her fire, her ambition, her part in the great shift that cracked England from its ancient spine. She had dared to speak, to question, to rise. She had fought for her daughter, and her words on the scaffold would become legend. Catherine was remembered only for her fall, her giggles, her naivety, her sin. But they forget that she, too, was a child of her time, a girl thrown into a lion's den, told to smile, and punished when she bled. The tower kept them both. Its walls did not speak, but they remembered. The Queen's stairs still bore the ghost of Anne's shoes. The Traitor's Gate still echoed with Catherine's breath. And in the years that followed, the rooms where they wept became part of the stone's memory. A silence that did not forget. 2 arrests. 2 names, stolen. 2 women who walked into the tower under the weight of history and never walked back out again. And the walls did not echo, but they listened. Justice, like mercy, is a word best understood by those who never received it. In the courts of Tudor England, justice often wore a crown of convenience and walked hand in hand with power. For queens like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, justice was not a right, it was a performance. Written by men, spoken by liars, and concluded before the first line was ever read aloud. Their trials, or the absence of them, reveal not only the cruelty of the age, but the terrifying ease with which a woman could be condemned when she no longer suited the desires of the king. Anne Boleyn was granted a trial, or something that resembled one. It was held in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, beneath high beams and cold stone walls, a space where voices echoed in uncomfortable ways. It was the 15th day of May in the year 1536, when she stood before a jury of peers who were not her peers at all, but powerful men handpicked to deliver a verdict already decided. Among them sat her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, whose presence was less that of a family guardian and more that of a political executioner. The air was thick with tension and something colder certainty. Anne stood accused of treason, adultery, and incest. The names of the men she was said to have betrayed the king with were read aloud, 5 in total, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The accusations were as grotesque as they were impossible, citing times and places that did not match her whereabouts, assigning her the kind of recklessness no queen could have performed unnoticed. But facts were not required, only theater. She stood tall, denied all charges, and maintained her innocence with the dignity of one who knew that her voice would be heard, not in her lifetime, but in the centuries to come. And still, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death, to be carried out in a manner chosen by the king himself. They say that Henry VIII showed her mercy. Instead of the English axe, he sent for a French swordsman, famed for his swiftness and precision. But mercy, when given by the same hand that orchestrated the need for it, is hollow. Anne's trial had been a mockery, her fate a foregone conclusion, and her dignity, though intact, was no shield against the blade that awaited her. Her death had been crafted not by law, but by fear, politics, and the king's fading affection. Her trial had existed, yes, but justice had never arrived. Catherine Howard, on the other hand, was shown no trial at all. Her fall came in the year 1541, and with it came the invention of a law so sharp and so specific that it seemed to have been written with her blood in mind. After her marriage to the king, Parliament passed what would become known as the Royal Assent by Commission Act, a statute that made it high treason for a queen consort to fail to disclose her sexual past to the king within 20 days of their wedding. The timing of the act, and the speed with which it was applied, suggest that it was never intended to uphold justice. It was meant to ensure silence. It turned hindsight into guilt, memory into betrayal, and a girl's past into her execution. Catherine was young, perhaps no older than 17 when she died, though no birth record confirms it precisely. She had grown up in the care, or rather, The neglect of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. In a household that knew little of protection and less of discipline, there, unsupervised and naive, she was preyed upon by older men, including her music tutor, Henry VIII, and later Francis Dereham, both of whom would later be named in the accusations against her. These were not relationships born of equal standing or consent, but of manipulation and exploitation, a fact conveniently ignored when the crown chose to weaponize her past. After her arrest, Catherine was interrogated repeatedly. She confessed to certain details, perhaps out of fear, perhaps in a misguided attempt at honesty. She admitted to having known Francis Dereham before her marriage, and to exchanging promises of marriage with him, a detail that, under canon law, might have rendered her subsequent union with the king invalid. But when it came to Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, she denied any consummated relationship. Though she admitted to secret meetings and foolish words, it was enough. The damage was done. The law did not require a trial, only confession. And in the world Catherine inhabited, confession was indistinguishable from condemnation. The decision to forego a trial was not just a legal maneuver, it was a political message. It declared to the court, to the country, and to future queens, that the crown had the power not only to elevate a girl to the throne but to strip her bare of every dignity, every right, and every defense the moment she became inconvenient. The law had been created with surgical precision, and it sliced through Catherine's life without hesitation. She was condemned by statute, not by evidence. She would die not because she was proven guilty, but because she could not be proven innocent quickly enough to satisfy the king's growing impatience. The contrast between Anne's farcical trial and Catherine's legal erasure could not be starker. One was paraded through the semblance of justice, allowed to speak, to stand, to wear her innocence like armor. The other was locked away, unheard, unseen, sentenced in silence. Anne had a voice. Catherine had none. Anne had witnesses, though many were already dead or dying. Catherine had interrogators, but no advocates. Anne faced an audience of nobles. Catherine faced only the cold walls of the tower. And yet, beneath the cruelty of their separate paths, a shared truth binds them. Both were women undone, not by justice, but by power. Both were reduced from queens to criminals by the stroke of a pen or the whisper of a minister. Both were sacrificed to the king's need for sons, for control, for legacy. Their lives became footnotes in a larger story about a man who feared irrelevance more than sin, and who wielded the crown not as a symbol of unity but as a blade. In the years that followed, historians would debate the details. Some would call Anne ambitious, dangerous, a witch. Others would call Catherine foolish, wanton, a girl who danced too close to fire. But perhaps what matters more than how they were seen is how they were treated by the men who wrote the laws, the men who signed the orders, and the king who loved them only when they obeyed. There was no justice for Anne. There was no trial for Catherine. Only laws that did not exist, until they did. Only verdicts that did not wait for truth. Only silence, where there should have been defense. And still, they walked through those final days with a strange, echoing strength. Anne faced her death with a calm that unsettled those who came to watch. Catherine, though young and terrified, asked for the execution block to be brought into her chamber so she could practice laying her head down correctly. They knew what justice looked like in their world, and they knew it would not come for them. And yet, they did not beg. They did not scream. They did not curse the king. They died with grace. And that, in the end, may be the only justice history allowed them. When we say their names now, let us say them not as victims of justice, but as victims of its absence. Let us remember not only how they died, but how quickly justice turned its back, how swiftly the laws bent to favor a single man's will, and how two queens so different, so distant in temperament and path, were both buried beneath verdicts. They never had the chance to fight. The mourning of a queen's death does not begin with trumpets. It begins with a hush, a breath held too long, the world listening for the sound of footsteps that might never come back. In the Tower of London, silence gathers long before the crowd. It lives in the stones, in the whispers of servants, in the uneven rhythm of a woman's heart, as she wakes knowing the hourglass has run dry. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two queens who died beneath the same sky, but under vastly different circumstances, that final walk to the scaffold revealed everything about how the world had come to see them, and everything about how the king had come to unsee them. Anne's execution was scheduled for the 19th day of May. In the year 1536, she had spent the night in prayer, restless, pacing the floor of her chamber, clutching her rosary with fingers that trembled but never broke. The swordsman had not yet arrived, delayed by winds from Calais, and so she waited not for mercy, for she knew better than to hope for that, but for an ending that would at least be quick. When the dawn finally crept across the sky, pale and cool, Anne asked her ladies to dress her in a gown of damask gray, a modest choice, heavy with dignity. She tied her hood herself. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and stepped out into the early morning air like a woman walking, not toward death, but toward judgment. The scaffold had been constructed within the tower's inner ward, a private place, shielded from the thronging masses, but not from the eyes that mattered. It was draped in black velvet, a fabric reserved for mourning of the highest order. Beneath her feet, soft cloth muffled her steps. Even in death, Anne was permitted the suggestion of queenly grace. The sword, hidden beneath a scattering of straw, waited silently, its edge polished like moonlight. The executioner, a Frenchman brought over specially at Henry's command, stood to one side, his expression unreadable. He had removed his shoes, a custom not of respect, but of mercy, to ensure she would not hear his approach. All details, carefully orchestrated to create a death that would seem clean, swift, and honorable. Anne ascended the scaffold with the help of the lieutenant of the tower, and once she reached the platform, she turned, not inward, but outward. She addressed the crowd, her voice calm, composed, unwavering. She said she came not to accuse, not to protest, not to defend. She thanked the king, called him gentle, merciful, a performance, perhaps, or a final plea for her daughter's safety. Those gathered could not know which. And then, with a breath, she knelt. She bound her eyes. She whispered, again and again, to Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. And in that moment, time slowed. The swordsman, now bare of sound, took up his blade. He signaled to an assistant to create a distraction. And as Anne turned slightly in confusion, he raised the sword high and swung not once, not twice, but cleanly, with a single stroke. The head of England's queen fell silently into the straw. Her ladies rushed forward, sobbing, wrapping the body in linen, refusing to let any man touch her. They carried her away with trembling arms, placing her remains into an arrow chest that had served no nobler purpose than to contain grain. No coffin had been prepared. The burial was hurried. But it was dignified what little dignity could be offered to a woman who had died so publicly, so unjustly, yet still as a queen. For Catherine Howard, the scene could not have been more different. Her execution was set for the 13th day of February. In the year 1542, the night before, she was told plainly she would die at 9 o'clock in the morning. There was no delay, no ritual, no foreign swordsman summoned in secrecy, only the tower guards, a scaffold, and a dull axe that had served too many times before. Catherine, still a teenager, reportedly asked for a block to be brought to her chamber, so that she might practice laying her head upon it. This simple, heartbreaking request, so small, so practical, revealed the terror she carried in her bones. She rehearsed her death because she had been denied everything else, even the illusion of choice. When the sun rose that morning, Catherine dressed without ceremony. She wore a black cloak over a plain gown. There were no ladies in waiting to offer comfort, only jailers. She had not been allowed the dignity of a final statement before Parliament or the court. Her voice had been silenced long before her body would be. As she approached the scaffold, witnesses said her legs trembled so violently that she had to be held upright. The air was sharp with cold, and the platform she climbed was strewn only with straw. No velvet, no cloth, no mourning silk. Only hay beneath her feet, coarse and indifferent. There were many in the crowd that day. London always gathered for executions, but they had come not to mourn, only to watch. Catherine's lips moved in silent prayer. Her skin pale, her eyes distant. When she reached the top, she spoke softly, acknowledging her sins, speaking of God's commandments, confessing that she deserved many deaths for offending the king. There is a rumor, oft repeated, that she said she would rather die the wife of Culpeper, the man she had loved before her downfall. But whether those words were truly spoken or simply invented after the fact by those who wanted romance woven into tragedy, no one can say. The only certainty is that her voice was barely heard, her figure barely standing, her presence already fading. The executioner handed her the blindfold, and she tied it herself. Then, as she had rehearsed, she knelt. The block was worn, stained, the wood scarred by those who had come before. She placed her head upon it, and a hush fell over the crowd. The executioner raised the axe, a heavy instrument with no elegance, and with a single blow, he severed her head from her body. Unlike Anne, there were no ladies rushing to cradle her, no linen cloths prepared in advance. Her body was covered with the cloak she had worn. Her head was lifted briefly, shown to the crowd with the traditional cry, "God save the King." The crowd remained silent. Catherine's body was taken not to a private resting place, but to the chapel of St. Peter, at Vincula, the same chapel where Anne had been laid. But Catherine's burial bore no resemblance to Anne's. There was no chest, no linens, no ceremony. Her body was placed directly into a hole dug hastily in the floor. Then, as if to erase her entirely, quicklime was poured over her remains, an act not of hygiene, but of obliteration. It burned through skin and bone, dissolving all trace, all form. Her grave was unmarked for centuries, and to this day, its location is known only by the patch of earth where the lime once smoked. A plaque above the floor commemorates her name, but it is just that, a marker for memory, not for presence. In the end, Anne died with the majesty of a queen, and the composure of a woman who knew the world would one day speak her name with awe. Catherine died with the silence of a forgotten girl, her story crushed beneath the weight of other sins. Anne's scaffold was draped in velvet. Catherine's was soaked in fear. Both bore their deaths with a courage that the men around them could never match. And both walked to the edge of the blade, with no one left to shield them. But the difference between velvet and straw is not just in texture, it is in remembrance. It is in how history chooses to dress its ghosts. It is said that in the final moment before death, a soul becomes light enough to drift, to rise, to leave behind the weight of the world it once carried. But for queens, even the dying breath is political, shaped by fear, memory, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, is listening. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the words they spoke, one with clarity, the other through trembled whispers, were not only their farewells but the last chance to define themselves before silence took hold. Anne's final mourning was bathed in a strange hush, the kind of quiet that settles only when too much has been said already. And there is nothing left but waiting. She had prayed throughout the night, her voice steady, her fingers moving across her rosary with the ritual of one raised in devotion and fear alike. But when the hour came, she did not weep, nor did she plead. She walked to the scaffold with a calm that startled the men around her. And when she turned to the gathered crowd, her voice did not falter. She spoke not as a victim, nor as a queen bitter with betrayal, but as a woman who understood that her last words would not remain only in that yard. Within those tower walls they would echo through centuries. She thanked the king. She praised him as merciful, called him a gentle and sovereign lord. She said she came not to accuse any man, nor to speak against the judgment rendered upon her. And yet, those who heard her would carry the weight of her composure for the rest of their days. She did not cry out injustice. She did not demand retribution. But beneath her words, there was something unspoken, something sharp, as the blade hidden in the straw beside her. A plea, not for herself, but for her daughter, Elizabeth. A plea wrapped in obedience, carefully disguised, but unmistakable to those who had ears to hear. Her words were measured, deliberate, as if each one had been chosen in a quiet rehearsal long before she had knelt. Good Christian people, she began, her voice clear. I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never was, and to me, he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. She paused, and the silence that followed was deeper than any before. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best, and thus I take my leave of the world and of you all. And I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. Then, kneeling upon the platform, blindfolded and still, she whispered again and again the words she wanted to be heard in heaven. If not by the King Jesus receive my soul. Jesus have pity on my soul. The wind caught the hem of her gown. The crowd held its breath, And in the quiet that followed, the sword was raised. It fell only once. Her words, however, would live. Catherine Howard did not speak so boldly, not because she lacked the strength, but because by the time she reached the scaffold, fear had already stolen her voice. Her final words are not remembered in the same way. They do not survive in formal record, not with the same weight, nor the same grace. They are half heard, half guessed, scattered among the letters of ambassadors and the memories of guards who stood too far back. But in what fragments remain, we find a different kind of tragedy, not the quiet defiance of a queen, but the fading echo of a girl whose life had never truly belonged to her. The night before her death, Catherine was told when and how she would die. She did not scream. She did not protest. Instead, she asked for a block. She wanted to rehearse. She wanted to practice how to kneel, how to place her neck, how to be still. It was not vanity. It was not ritual. It was fear, and perhaps a final attempt to reclaim something that had always been denied her control. In the early morning, her footsteps were unsteady. She wore a cloak of black, her hands clutched tightly at her sides. She was pale, and those who saw her said her lips moved constantly, but not loud enough for the words to be known. As she stepped upon the scaffold, she needed help. Her body betrayed her. Too young, too weak, too terrified. But she stood, and she tried to speak. She said she deserved many deaths for offending the king, and that she had sinned against God from her youth onward. She spoke of judgment, of punishment, of sorrow. There was no praise, no plea for mercy, no final philosophical reflection. She did not mention her family. She did not ask forgiveness from the crowd. She spoke not as a queen, but as a soul already halfway to the grave. The strength to perform had left her, and with it, the chance to shape her legacy. And yet, history clings to one sentence, a whisper, perhaps a rumor. She is said to have spoken, in her final moments, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." It may not be true. It may have been invented by those who sought to romanticize her fall, to cast her as a doomed lover, rather than a victim of manipulation and abandonment. But whether the words passed her lips or not, they reveal something that rings true. Catherine Howard had been loved badly, punished fiercely, and remembered vaguely. She had entered the palace with no voice, and she left it with only a whisper. When the axe fell, no one cried out. Her ladies did not rush forward. Her body was covered in the same cloak she had worn to the scaffold, and her head was raised not with reverence, but with routine. "God save the king," the executioner called, and the crowd began to disperse. She was buried in haste. No one repeated her words. No one engraved them in stone. Anne's last words were curated like a monument. Catherine's were lost like a breath on a winter morning. And yet, each woman faced her death with a kind of strength that defied the world that had failed them. Anne found clarity in her composure. Catherine found courage in simply walking forward, where one asked for mercy with elegance. The other surrendered with silence. And if history remembers one more than the other, if Anne's voice rings louder across the centuries, it is not because she was braver, but because someone chose to write it down. Someone made the choice to keep her words, to turn them into a legacy, to drape her memory in velvet. Catherine's voice was allowed to vanish. Her story was not crafted, it was erased. But if you listen closely, if you stand in the quiet corners of the tower, when the crowds have gone and the light fades, you might still hear her, not in grand declarations, but in the soft rustle of a girl trying to kneel, in the echo of a breath caught in her throat, in the silence that was too weak to speak but still tried. It is one thing to die. It is another to be carried. Another still, to be remembered. For queens, even their remains become instruments of politics, relics of power, or symbols of shame. But the way a body is treated after death says more about the living than the dead. It reveals what was feared, what was forgotten, and what was never forgiven. When Anne Boleyn fell upon the scaffold in the Tower of London in the year 1536, her death may have been swift, but what followed it was deliberate. And when Catherine Howard knelt in the same place 6 years later, in the year 1542, what was done to her afterwards told a different kind of story, one not of ceremony, but of erasure. Anne's execution ended with silence. The moment her head fell, the crowd stood frozen in stillness, the wind lifting the hem of her gown, the blood soaking into the straw, like ink into parchment. But before the silence became too long, her ladies moved. There were 3 of them, chosen not by accident, but by loyalty. Women who had shared her laughter, her fears, and her final nights. They stepped forward without hesitation. Though the guards around them had already begun to stir, the women carried a length of linen white, clean, pressed as if it had been prepared for a child's baptism rather than a queen's final journey. They did not weep loudly, for grief at the scaffold was expected to be composed, but their hands trembled as they wrapped her head, then her body, in that holy cloth. No man was permitted to touch the queen's remains. This was not custom. This was command. Her ladies, in quiet defiance, or perhaps in reverence, shielded her from the indignity of male hands, lifting her between them as though she were sleeping. Her body, slight and broken, was carried across the green in the arms of those who had loved her, or at least understood her. There was no coffin prepared, for no one had thought her worthy of such effort. Instead, an arrow chest meant for storing bows and bolts was fetched and brought forward. It was plain, wooden, unlined, but it was something. Into it they placed her, gently, reverently, and closed the lid. There was no royal procession, no trumpets, no horses, only a few muffled steps through the tower grounds toward the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the place where so many stories ended, and so few were honored. Anne was buried beneath the stone floor, in a space so small and unmarked that for centuries no one could say for certain where her bones lay. And yet, she was carried by love, or at least by ritual. She was laid with care, and every year thereafter, roses would be left for her, laid by strangers who whispered her name as they bent low in the chapel light. Her grave would one day be marked. Her name would one day be carved in stone. Her legacy would remain. But Catherine's body was not given such peace. Her death came just after dawn, the sky gray, with the last traces of winter. The axe had struck her once, maybe twice. The details blurred by the haste with which her death was conducted. There were no ladies to catch her, no linen cloth to shield her. Her body crumpled to the scaffold floor, her hair falling across her shoulders, her eyes already closed. She had no women close enough to claim her, no command given to preserve her modesty, no hands rushing forward to protect what was left of her dignity. The executioner did his duty. The guards stood back. There was no ceremony, only a cloak black, coarse, stiff, with cold, thrown over her body like a curtain over a stage once the act had ended. Her remains were taken quickly. There was no chest, no box, no vessel. She was carried without reverence, without procession, to the same chapel where Anne had been buried. But the difference was not just in tone. It was in substance, where Anne had been wrapped and cradled. Catherine was placed directly into the ground, her limbs folded as best they could be, her head beside her, the blood not yet dry. And then, someone gave an order, whether it was spoken quietly or written in advance. No one recorded, but it was done. Quicklime. The white substance was poured over her body in generous quantity. More than needed. More than expected. It hissed as it met the moisture of death. It burned into flesh and bone alike, eating away not only at what remained, but at what could be remembered. Quicklime was not used for hygiene, though that was the excuse some would later offer. No. This was punishment. This was obliteration. This was the kingdom's way of saying that Catherine Howard should not only die, en but disappear. She was the only one in that chapel among all the executed, among all the discarded to be buried with such violence after death. The lime worked quickly, within days. There was little left that could be recognized. Within weeks, the ground above her settled flat, as though she had never been there at all. Her grave was never marked. Her name was not carved. For centuries, visitors passed over her resting place without knowing. The plaque that eventually came was based on speculation, placed in a spot where evidence of quicklime remained in the soil. That was all they had. A chemical trace of shame. No roses. No rituals. No whispers of memory. Anne's legacy lived on in her daughter. Elizabeth became queen. She ruled for more than 4 decades. She rebuilt the kingdom and carried her mother's fire in every word she spoke. And so Anne was remembered, and so her bones were protected by the history her daughter created. Catherine had no daughter, no son, no protector. Her name fell from memory before her body had cooled. She was a scandal, a warning, a lesson whispered to future queens: do not love, do not err. Do not remember that you were once a girl. She was mentioned in passing, in footnotes, in rumors. Her story was not preserved. It was rewritten, softened, dismissed. And yet, they had both been used. Both had been hunted. Both had been broken. The difference lay not in their guilt, but in how useful their memory could be to those who came after. Anne was claimed by the Protestant cause. She became a symbol of England's break from Rome, a martyr for a new order, a name that could be painted onto banners. Catherine was claimed by no one, no religion, no dynasty, no historian eager to defend her. She was not useful, and so she was discarded. And still, in that chapel, the same roof covers them both. The same stones lay flat above them. The same light filters through the stained glass. But beneath, only one of them rests in full. The other was reduced, consumed, devoured by a punishment that reached past death. Not for her crimes, but for her powerlessness, for the discomfort her name brought to those who had failed her. So when you visit the tower, when you kneel on the cold floor of St. Peter ad Vincula and press your hand to the stone, remember this. Some names are carved in marble because history chose to remember them. Others were burned to ash because someone chose to forget. Anne was carried by women who would not let her go. Catherine was swallowed by quicklime, poured by hands that would not let her stay. There are some who die and are reborn in the mouths of poets, in the ink of chroniclers, in the prayers of nations, and there are others who die only once, and whose silence deepens with every century, until even the earth no longer remembers the shape of their name. In the long shadows cast by the Tower of London, two women once knelt. Both were queens. Both were executed by the same king. But only one would leave behind a daughter who would wear the crown longer than any monarch before her, while the other would vanish so completely that her body could never be found again. One legacy would be carved in marble, the other lost beneath layers of stone and shame. Anne Boleyn's daughter was born on a warm September day in the year 1533. In the Palace of Greenwich, she was not the son that the king had prayed for. She was not the heir who would secure a dynasty. And yet, from her first breath, Elizabeth bore the weight of change, born not into the old world, but into a new one forged by her mother's ambition and her father's rebellion. Anne had risked everything to put that child into a cradle gilded with power. She had the fiat, a queen, a pope, a kingdom's expectation. And for a brief moment, she held the world in her hands. But when Anne was executed just 2 years later, her daughter was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and removed from the line of succession. The cradle became a cage. The crown she had been born to inherit turned its back. Still, Elizabeth lived. She watched. She learned. And when the time came when death finally claimed her half-siblings and the throne stood empty, she stepped forward. No longer the discarded child of a disgraced queen, but a sovereign in her own right. In the year 1558, she became queen, and for 44 years, she ruled with fire in her blood and ice in her mind. After every breath, a resurrection of her mother's name. It was through Elizabeth that Anne Boleyn's memory endured. The portraits returned. The stories softened. The whispers turned to homage. People began to lay roses on Anne's grave each year on the anniversary of her execution. They stood in silence before her memorial stone at St. Peter ad Vincula. They wrote her name in the margins of books, carved it into locket clasps, embroidered it onto hidden sleeves. She became a symbol not of scandal, but of change. A queen destroyed not by guilt, but by power she dared to wield. She became, in time, a martyr of sorts, not for faith, but for the idea that a woman could shape a kingdom and still hold her head high, even as it was taken from her shoulders. Elizabeth never spoke her mother's name in public. Not once. But she wore the memory like a hidden jewel, close to the skin. She adopted Anne's motto, "The most happy," in Latin. She surrounded herself with ministers and courtiers who had once served her mother. She refused to marry. Some said, because she had seen what marriage had cost Anne. And when Elizabeth died in the year 1603, she died as the last Tudor sovereign. The final chapter of the dynasty Anne had given her life to begin. In Elizabeth, Anne had found immortality, but Catherine Howard had no such daughter. No child. No bloodline. No one left behind who might carry her name into light. She died young. Too young for legacy. Too lost to be remembered. No chapel was filled with prayers for her. No hand wrote her words into letters kept for posterity. No queen returned to vindicate her story. Catherine's name faded with the breath that left her lungs on that cold February morning. And the silence that followed grew so vast that even the ground forgot where to hold her. Her grave was never marked. The plaque that now bears her name rests not above her body, but above a guess. When renovations were done in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula centuries later, Anne Boleyn's remains were identified by a combination of royal accounts and bone structure, but Catherine was gone. The only clue to her resting place was the presence of quicklime in the soil, lime poured not to preserve, but to erase. The patch of ground that smoldered for days after her burial became the only map to her bones. Some say she lies just beside Anne, as if fate placed them side by side at last. Others believe her body has long since dissolved, her remains indistinguishable from the dust that covers the chapel floor. Unlike Anne, Catherine receives no roses on the anniversary of her death. No monarchs speak her name. Her legacy lies not in tribute, but in cautionary tales whispered about courtly girls who laugh too freely, who dance too often, who love too carelessly. And yet, there is cruelty in that forgetting. Because Catherine Howard was not reckless, she was unprotected. She was not a flirt. She was a girl surrounded by men who preyed upon her ignorance and called it consent. She did not rise to power. She was placed there, without warning, without guidance, and expected to bear the weight of a crown heavier than she could understand. Her only crime was being too young in a world that gave her no time to grow. In the absence of a child to redeem her, in the absence of a court to mourn her, in the absence of justice to honor her, she became what history often makes of women. It cannot control an echo, a rumor, a body lost beneath the stones. But even in silence, even in invisibility, something remains. Visitors still pause before her plaque, uncertain of where to look. The light that falls through the stained glass sometimes touches her name. A few historians, quiet in their sympathy, write of her with gentleness. And on cold February mornings, when the chapel is empty, the silence carries something else, an ache, a question, a sense that someone is still waiting to be found. Anne Boleyn left behind a queen who changed the world. Catherine Howard left behind only herself buried. It, but not entirely gone. And perhaps that is the difference. Anne was remembered because of who came after. Catherine must be remembered because of who never came at all. If Anne's legacy was carved in the marble of palaces and the records of Parliament, then Catherine's must be carved in the conscience of those who tell her story. Not as a seductress, not as a fool, not as a girl who should have known better, but as a warning of what happens when power is paired with neglect, when innocence is mistaken for danger, and when a girl is asked to be queen before she is even allowed to be human. The daughter who reigned carried her mother's fire into the light. The girl, no one could find again, waits, still, beneath the earth, perhaps not to be raised, but simply to be named. History does not remember everyone the same way. Some are painted in gold leaf, held up as icons of courage or cunning, studied in classrooms and debated in parliaments. Others are left in the margins, misremembered, misunderstood. Their names pass down in whispers that grow more twisted with every telling. When it comes to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both queens who knelt beneath the blade of a husband's command, it is not their deaths alone that divide them, but how the world chose to speak of them once they could no longer speak for themselves. Anne was, from the beginning, impossible to ignore. Even in life, she was polarizing, sharp of tongue, bold in spirit, and dangerously educated in a court where women were expected to be pretty, pliant, and quiet. She rose not with innocence, but with wit. She captivated a king not with coyness, but with resistance. And though her enemies were many, her voice survived the scaffold. In the centuries after her death, historians returned to her name again and again, each one drawing her anew, some as a saint, others as a seductress, still others as a scapegoat for the political thunderstorm of the English Reformation. But no matter how she was portrayed, Anne was never forgotten. Some called her a martyr, not for a faith, but for a future. Others framed her as the mother of Elizabeth, and therefore the mother of a golden age. Her downfall, they argued, was not caused by sin, but by a man who grew tired of her questions, her sharpness, her refusal to fade quietly into the background once the crown was hers. The portraits of Anne changed over time from enemy to heroine, from homewrecker to reformer, from queen in disgrace to queen of memory, and though the truth of her heart may never be fully known, the kindness of later pens softened her image, dressing her legacy in dignity. Where once there had only been scandal, her words on the scaffold were repeated, memorized, quoted. Her black veiled dress, her French executioner, her whispered prayers, all were preserved, as if they were relics. Writers, centuries after she was gone, he would still pause to imagine the scene, the wind against her hood, the silent swoop of the sword, the way she smiled as she said goodbye. Whether or not it was true no longer mattered. It was beautiful. It was tragic. It was remembered. But Catherine was not offered the same compassion. From the first moment, the axe struck her neck. The stories of Catherine Howard were buried in shame. She was the queen who sinned, the girl who flirted too freely, the child woman who never knew when to stop smiling. Even in the official accounts of her downfall, her voice is faint, obscured beneath the voices of men who condemned her, judges who never heard her, and witnesses who were forced to speak against her to save their own lives. In the Chronicles of the Realm, she was painted not with brushstrokes of curiosity or reverence, but with thick lines of ridicule. She became a cautionary tale, nothing more. Rumors surrounded her like smoke. They said she had confessed with pride. They said she had loved too much. They said she had laughed as she walked to the block, or that she had whispered a lover's name as the blade came down. But none of these stories were written by those who knew her. They were inventions, echoes, passed down because the truth was too quiet and too sad to keep people's attention. She was rarely studied, rarely defended, rarely mourned in the pages of official history. While Anne's story was retold with poetry and pathos, Catherine's became a warning passed down to girls who were told not to be foolish, not to fall, not to be her. And yet, when the archives are opened, when the letters are read, when the facts are laid bare, a different Catherine begins to appear. A girl whose guardians failed her. A girl groomed by men who should have protected her. A girl who was placed in a position she did not ask for, and then punished for not understanding how to survive it. The historians who dared to speak kindly of her did not do so loudly. They wrote in footnotes, in quiet prefaces, in chapters often overlooked. But they asked questions the others did not. Why was she left alone so often? Why was she not better educated? Why were the men who took advantage of her not held to account? Why was she the only one who was erased? Some modern writers have begun to answer. They speak of Catherine not as a fallen woman, but as a silenced one, not as a seductress, but as a survivor. They trace the outlines of her story with care, peeling away the layers of judgment that centuries have piled upon her shoulders. And what they find is not a queen of scandal, but a girl of sorrow. A girl who never had the chance to grow old enough to make better choices. A girl who was thrown into a marriage with a decaying king, who reached for love where she could find it, who was punished not for betrayal, but for longing. But even these voices, though compassionate, have not changed the popular story. In films, in novels, in television shows, Catherine is still the silly one, the flirty one, the doomed romantic. Her complexity is too often sacrificed for drama. Her pain is turned into entertainment. And the truth that she was likely the most vulnerable and least protected of all Henry's queens still lies buried beneath the quicklime poured over her name as much as over her bones. The difference in how the world speaks of Anne and Catherine does not come from what they did, but from what they left behind. Anne left behind a daughter who changed England. Catherine left behind only silence. And history listens more closely to echoes that lead to crowns. But even so, the rumors that refuse to die are not only about Catherine's shame, they are also about what we have refused to see. They are about the discomfort of facing what happens when a young woman is destroyed not by her choices, but by the choices made for her. They are about the cruelty of a world that remembers some sins and forgets others. They are about the stories we tell, and why we choose to tell them. Anne's story was shaped by those who wished to see her as powerful, or dangerous, or brave. Catherine's story was shaped by those who needed someone to blame. But now, centuries later, the ink is still wet. The story is still changing. And if we choose to speak more kindly of Catherine Howard not out of pity, but out of recognition, then perhaps, just perhaps, we allow her to rise, not as a rumor, but as a woman, because even the forgotten deserve to be remembered with truth. It is in the stillness, when the candles have burned low and the voices of the day have vanished into soft breath, that history begins to whisper. Not the loud kind of history, not the kind carved into arches and sung in anthems, but the quieter sort, the kind that clings to the stone beneath your feet, to the spaces between the names on a memorial plaque, to the hollow, inside a chapel, where footsteps no longer echo. In this stillness, the Tower of London is no longer a fortress or a landmark or a tourist's dream. It is a tomb made of memory, and inside it, two women remain, not only in the dust, but in the silence. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were not the first to die at the hands of a king. They were not the first women to be accused, nor the first to be forgotten. But they are the ones who returned to us, who slipped through the cracks of the centuries, who refused to vanish entirely. One through her daughter, who wore a crown longer than any before her. The other, through the soft persistence of those who began to question the version of her that had been handed down like a warning in a mother's scold. They are not just historical figures now. They are presences. And late at night, when the world is quiet, it is possible to hear them again, not in words, perhaps, but in weight. There is a weight to injustice that does not fade, a kind of ache that stays lodged between the ribs of a nation that pretended for too long that some deaths mattered more than others. Henry VIII is remembered with songs and portraits, with tapestries and tombs, with a crown that still traces its line back to him. But for all his power, he was a man who never learned how to love without destroying, how to desire without devouring. He left 6 wives in his wake, 2 divorced, 2 dead, 1 survived, and 1 faded into silence. He gave England a church, but he paid for it in blood. He gave England a son, but he buried most of the women who gave it to him. He built a legacy on the bodies of women. And still, it is the women we remember most. Anne was not perfect. She was proud, ambitious, shrewd, but none of those things were crimes. She spoke when others stayed silent. She challenged the rules. She entered the king's bed not as a concubine, but as a rival to the queen, and she died not because she sinned, but because she failed to give him a son. That was the only crime that could not be forgiven, in a world where lineage was everything, and a womb that produced daughters was seen not as sacred, but as insufficient. And yet, the daughter she did bear became more than any king could have imagined. Elizabeth reigned for more than 4 decades, She forged alliances, defeated invaders, and ruled alone, refusing to hand over power through marriage. Her every decision echoed her mother's defiance. Her every speech bore the sharpness of Anne's tongue. Her every portrait, regal and unbending, it seemed to say that no man would ever again tell a Boleyn woman how to kneel. In Elizabeth, Anne was not only remembered, she was vindicated. Catherine had no such champion. She died alone. Young. Afraid. She left no heir. No legacy. No royal triumph. To balance the brutality of her ending, she was mourned by no state. Praised by no parliament. Remembered by no poet in her time. The world let her vanish. But still, she whispers. In the cracks of the chapel stones, in the places where girls grow up too fast, in the lessons taught too late. She was not powerful, not calculating, not prepared. And so, history found her easier to discard. But Catherine's story is not one of seduction. It is one of abandonment. She was a girl raised without protection, thrown into a court of wolves, and expected to smile. She was prey mistaken for predator. A girl whose truth was never written, and whose body was burned away with quicklime, as if memory itself were a stain to be scrubbed clean. But no amount of lime can stop a ghost, and Catherine has become one. Not a ghost of fear, but of regret. She returns in the questions we ask now. Could she have been saved? Who failed her? Why did no one see her? Her face lives not in portraits, but in patterns, the patterns of all the girls like her who came after, who were judged too quickly, punished too harshly, erased too easily. And the tragedy is not only that she died, but that she was forgotten. This is what Henry VIII left behind. Not only a country torn from Rome, not only sons who died too young, or wives who wept too long. He left behind silence, a kind of royal silence that covered over the cries of those who could not fight back. And now, centuries later, we peel back that silence, like old wallpaper. We read the letters. We walk the halls. We place flowers. We say the names. Anne, Catherine, they are still there. In the velvet that covered the scaffold. In the straw that smelled of fear. In the linen cloth held by trembling hands. In the block brought to a girl's prison chamber so she could practice her own death. In the sword hidden beneath straw. In the axe that did not forgive. In the stone that marks a queen. In the soil that never found a girl. In the words spoken boldly. In the words never heard at all. They are not just history. They are memory. And so, if you find yourself walking past the Tower of London as night begins to fall, stop, just for a moment. Listen, not for footsteps or sounds of battle, not for iron gates or ancient drums, but for breath, for prayer, for a whisper. You might hear Anne, reciting her innocence with grace, still proud in her final hour. You might hear Catherine, whispering the name of someone who once held her hand when no one else did. You might hear nothing at all. And that, too, is a sound worth remembering, because silence is not absence. Sometimes, it is the truest form of testimony.